Do you want to learn the tricks that top leaders use to get the most out of themselves and their teams? Well, Naftali Hoff is here to help. Lead to succeed. Picks the brains of top leaders to learn about their challenges, insights, and best practices. Here's Naftali.
Hello, Lead to Succeed Nation. It's Naftali Hoff, and welcome to Lead to Succeed, episode 168. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Cynthia Kane. Cynthia helps people enhance their lives and relationships by teaching them how to become less reactive in difficult conversations and speak to themselves, others, and their environment in a kind, honest, and helpful way. She has taught over 70,000 people how to change the way they communicate through her books, such as How to Communicate Like a Buddhist, Talk to Yourself Like a Buddhist, How to Meditate Like a Buddhist, her best-selling DailyOM Course, and the Kane Intentional Communication Training Program. She's a certified meditation and mindfulness instructor, certified breathing coach, and founder of the Kane Intentional Communication Institute, LLC. Her new book, The Pause Principle, How to Keep Your Cool in Tough Situations, releases on January 22nd, 2025. And without further ado, Cynthia, great to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to talk with you.
Likewise. Okay, so it's your chance to shine. Why don't you unpack that bio a little bit, or tell me something that the bio did not include? What's your story? How did you get here?
Sure. So I got here in a very roundabout way, shall we say. I was a very horrible communicator. I was very passive aggressive, very judgmental, the queen of shutting down and walking away from difficult confrontational situations, very scared of those. And I also had a lot of, anxiety, really caught up in the future, or sometimes really stuck in the past. And I didn't know any of this until my first love passed away unexpectedly, and I was thrown into a lot of discomfort. It was the most difficult period in my life, and I really had to figure out how to find a way to feel better here. And so a lot of the work that I was then doing was really searching to figure out how to change the way that I was living so that I was enjoying my life more. And I started reading lots of books and taking courses and, coaching and retreats and all that wonderful stuff. And a friend of mine had introduced me to a workshop over a weekend that was a writing and meditation workshop. And when I went that weekend, my world opened up and everything started to shift for me. So I ended up learning how to meditate that weekend. I learned the elements of right speech in Buddhism that weekend. And for me, that was my way forward. I was really aware of the fact that if I wanted to find my way out of the suffering and the discomfort that I was in, there were practices now that I could start to do to help myself with that. And so it became more of a life experiment to figure out how to communicate in a kind, honest, and helpful way. And the more I started practicing, the more I realized how much more comfortable I was becoming within those uncomfortable moments, where before I would really shy away from confrontation. Suddenly I was really able to be in those hard, stressful interactions and not be taken over by my emotion, but be able to stay in the room even when it was hard. And I started writing about it, started teaching, and that's really how it all grew from there. There was not only me who was experiencing this, but lots of other people experience it too, just the difficulty within interactions and really learning how to not be led by the emotion, but how to express ourselves calmly in those really high stakes, stressful discomfort, right? And so, yeah, that's how it all grew into then a training program and mentorship and one-to-one work and courses and so on and so forth. So I didn't set out to work with people on communication because I was definitely not the best communicator. And I'm practicing every single day. So
Interesting.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure what intrigues me more. And it's interesting because I actually do training on difficult conversations as well. And I
Yeah.
just did one last week for a large nonprofit with 60 plus mid-level managers
Mm.
and senior managers.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get into all the specifics of the workshop per se, but I'm curious to know from your vantage point whether you want to talk about your own personal experience or you want to
Sure.
just share what you see from others.
Hmm.
There's nature and nurture in a lot of the elements of our lives, and some of it may be that we had certain, let's call it challenging situations in our upbringing or different points in our life that conditioned us, if you will, in a way that maybe makes communication harder, or maybe
Yeah.
we thought that it wasn't a pathway that we could really tap into or channel, or it might just be circumstantial where, everybody has things that they don't really want to have to go through or to
Yeah.
communicate, like negative feedback or things
Mhm.
of that nature. So I'm just curious to sort of like, if you took us behind the scenes, if you lifted the curtain a little bit, what are you saying is ultimately the biggest factor or some of the bigger factors contributing to this problem in the first place? And how do you
Yeah.
help people to get past that? How do you help people to if not circumvent it, maybe see a new pathway forward?
Hmm. Yeah, so I do believe that so much of the way that we communicate is, from our upbringing in a lot of ways. It is um, something that we absorb, the models of communication that we saw growing up. It's also, it could be a teacher, it could be a partner, it could be, you know, uh, the media. We're influenced by so much. And so a lot of times our patterns and habits of communication aren't necessarily our own. It also comes from, I think, past experiences. If we've had one experience that didn't go so well, it's very easy to label all experiences in that way, which make it difficult to express ourselves or try something new in a conversation. And also, scarcity, I think, is a big piece, just that lens through which there's not enough, as opposed to through a lens of, more abundant or a positive lens. And the work that I do to help kind of unlearn a lot of our past patterns has to do, I really believe that communication begins in the body. And it's that, Viktor Frankl quote that is between, stimulus and response, there's a space. And in that space lies our power to choose our response. And in that response is our freedom. And so the work that I focus on is really that moment, right? Like that moment before we react the same way that we usually do. And once we can tap in more to what's happening in the body in that uncomfortable moment and really acknowledge it and see it, work with that discomfort, then we can express ourselves differently. Then we can start to see what the next right action would be. Then we can start to see potentially, oh, this isn't my voice. This is my mother's voice. This is my father's voice. This is a label that I was given, or this is coming through the lens of fear. And so we give ourselves this opportunity to find that pause, to find that breath, so that we can then have clarity in terms of the next, you know, interaction that we choose.
So maybe this is a good segue. We talked about
Yeah.
your book before.
Hmm.
It seems like it really is along the lines of what you were just describing. Maybe talk a little bit more about what the book focuses on and what people stand to gain from reading it.
Yeah, so the book itself is really helping you with tools and practices in stressful interactions, in like during a stressful interaction, to grab a practice to help you calm the body in that moment. Because in these difficult situations, we're in that fight flight nervous system, we're in our sympathetic nervous system. And that's where our armor comes up. That's where we start to, right, defend ourselves, over explain, potentially lash out. And if we can signal to the body that we're in a safe place and that, everything is okay, we're not being chased by lions, that then everything calms and then we can have dialogue, right? So the book itself is really helping you with those stressful moments, giving you practices to be able to find that breath, find that space to be able to gather yourself, to stay in the room, have the conversation show up the way that you want to. And so there's a specific practice that's called the soften practice, which really teaches you how to substitute. It's almost like you're substituting that fear in the moment for calm in the moment. And the practice itself is called soften. And they're different tools that you can use to help you navigate the difficult interaction easily.
Mm. Yeah, you did reference something just before, and I want to loop back to something you said even earlier,
Yep.
but one thing at a time.
Mhm.
I often use this practice of sharing with people, like, what's the worst that could happen? Have
Mhm.
this mindset of this is the cliff, this is like the absolute worst. I actually use that same metaphor when I was when I was doing that training that I referenced
Oh, yeah.
earlier. Oftentimes we're so afraid of the
Yeah.
outcomes of the conversation. Say, so what really could be the worst that could happen? And you list it, and it could be terrible, but the likelihood of that coming to be is pretty low, right?
Mhm.
And it's usually the absolute worst. And I could probably even live with that. So, with that said, let's now walk off the cliff a little bit and let's unpack it and say, what's likely the worst that's going to actually happen? And how could we avoid that?
Yeah.
Now, I do want to go back to one thing you actually mentioned it a couple of times. It felt to me, and this is not in any way a critique or a limitation, but I felt like you were talking more on the reactive side. So, in other words, if I'm put in a situation where somebody is saying something to me that feels threatening, that
Mhm.
don't put up your armor, approach it in the right kind of way, soften your the affects and all the elements so that you can engage in the conversation in a healthy and open manner, which is
Mhm.
fantastic.
Yeah.
I was I was thinking as you were talking, because part of my presentation, for example, it's actually mostly on the proactive side, because if I'm
Mhm.
talking to a manager, for example, I have to share with them how do they lead a difficult conversation, right? They're scheduling the conversation, they're scheduling the meeting. I've got a
Right.
direct report, she's not showing up on time, he's not delivering in a clear manner. The
Mhm.
people that he services are not feeling
Right.
the love, so to speak, whatever that is. So I have to be the bearer of bad news, if you will. And I
Mhm.
have to figure out, can I reorient and get this person back on track and bring them to a better place?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if you could speak to that as well, because that also, yes, I'm planning it. So maybe I'm not caught by surprise, but I
Mhm.
still, in many ways, it's almost worse because
Yeah.
I've got to plan it and I'm thinking about it, I'm ruminating and
Mhm.
it's churning in my mind. Will it work? Will it work? Will it work? Will they be
Yeah.
upset at me? All that stuff. So I'm curious to know your take there.
Yeah. So when we're planning a difficult conversation or going to have a difficult conversation, we are still actually looking inward first before we actually engage, right? So the idea would be to listen to yourself in that moment, to understand what it is that you want and need out of the conversation, right? Like, what is the outcome of the conversation? And then the work is to see, is what I'm about to say kind? Is it honest? Is it helpful? And to make sure that you're going in with a friendly attitude, right? Like a non-judgmental attitude, so that you can really be there and be present. So a lot of the work before a difficult conversation is figuring out what the outcome is, understanding what your responsibility is in a conversation as well, right? When we're giving difficult feedback, oftentimes what's challenging is we are still nervous about the reaction of the other person. So we have to talk to ourselves about that piece before we go in, understanding that like this is my position. It's possible, right, that the person is going to be upset. How can I hold space in that moment for that person? Not give over to them, not, go into my default reaction, but how can I hold space in that moment and allow the person to react however they want to react? So before a difficult conversation, really understanding that whatever the reaction is that the other person has is okay, because your practice in the moment is to allow that person to react and then for you to learn how to respond to that reaction, right? And when we understand my responsibility in a conversation is, my language, my body language, my tone, how I'm using silence, my facial expressions, the other person's responsibility is that, and all that we have in common is the health of the conversation, then the focus is easy in a difficult conversation because you become more aware of if it's going into hurtful territory or if it's going into, a place where there's more tension or reactivity. And then you get to keep the integrity of the conversation intact, bring it back to the path forward of it being, helpful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. There was one thing that I was thinking about in particular as you were talking.
Hmm.
Um, you talked about you talked about being kind.
Yeah.
And you did talk about, well, the way I interpret it is oftentimes people will begin with some kind of positive intention, maybe some praise, so
Mhm.
the focus on the things you're working on. And so
Yeah.
I'm just curious because this is a question that comes up a lot, and I have my own, I guess I'd say, mixed views on this. It's something called the sandwich technique, right?
Okay.
Where
Oh, yeah.
you deliver the good news and you end with the good news and you drop the proverbial bomb in the middle, even if it's not dropped as a bomb, but
Mhm.
the part that needs to be fixed, let's call it.
Yeah.
So I don't know. There's a part of me that feels that that's disingenuous, that
Mhm.
kind of see through that. On the
Yeah.
other hand, you don't want to just walk in, I don't think, just cutting straight to the chase and saying, we got something we got to work on. Curious to know what your approach is and what you have heard or observed with
Mhm.
regards to that technique in particular.
Yeah. So I definitely have heard of the sandwich technique. I think that the challenge in these interactions is being human, right? And at the same time, remaining professional. And there's a balance. And I think what's best and what I've seen work really well is when someone comes in and they meet the person where they're at. They're not trying to establish a, like a better than or less than attitude. It really is connecting with the person first, not necessarily about what they need to work on or about the issue itself, but that personal relationship that they might have, right? Connecting with them on, you know, maybe they know that the person is in a book club and loves books, or that they like specific movies, or they just went away for the weekend with their family, but connecting with them on a personal level first, and then leading into saying it's been brought to my attention, or I've been noticing recently or lately, and then you just dive in. It becomes more of a relaxed conversation. It's more in our minds, we can make these conversations really, really big. And our work is, can we actually make them smaller? Can we make it more conversational? Less, one person and then the other person. And it becomes more of a fluid, regular conversation that you'd have just like you'd be going out to coffee with somebody, right?
Mhm.
So it's more a natural lead in.
So there's a part of me that hears that loud and clear, and
Hmm.
then there's a part of me that wants to push back. So I'll give you some
Yeah.
context.
Yeah.
You may or may not be familiar with this particular model, but it's just as an example. So there are different personality type,
Yeah.
systems, let's call it, with assessments and whatnot, and they tie into leadership as well. And one of them that I often use in a training platform is called True Colors. And the
Okay.
two colors that really speak to me personally the most, one because I identify with it, and one because I don't identify with it, are
Mhm.
blue and green. And blue
Okay.
is very empathic and very people centered. And it's all about I make the connection first and then I lead second, if you will. But I'm not going to really engage with you until I feel I know you and I feel I can connect as a person. Whereas the green is all about solving the problem. So, let's not talk fluff. Let's get right to
Right.
it. You have an issue. I want to solve it. I want to get on with my day, etc. And so you can imagine, or we can imagine, that blues would be aggravating for greens because greens just want to get right to it. They're not interested in
Sure.
all this
Mhm.
conversational stuff. And the
Yes.
opposite is also true. A blue that feels that he or she is being led, let's say, by a green or interacting with them, and they're not making any effort whatsoever to relate first, they'd find that very, very frustrating.
Hmm.
So I'm just wondering, in the environment that you were describing before, where you have people that are not connectors by nature, or they would say, "Come on, I'm about to have a meeting with this person. I have an agenda. I'm not here to ask you about your weekend. I'm not here
Yeah.
to ask, I'm here to just deliver the
Yeah.
message, cut to the chase, solve the problem. Let's move on.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm just wondering, I almost wonder if people like that would be more stressed out by the advice to connect rather than just how to actually have the conversation. So
Sure.
I'm curious to know what you
Yeah.
experienced there.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely would be more stressful for that person, right? Though the upside of doing this is the connection that you build, which then builds a bond, which then builds trust, which then builds loyalty, right? The the challenge is not so I love assessments and I think that they're wonderful because they are very, very helpful in being able to figure out kind of which direction to go in a very clear way, right? The other piece, though, that's difficult is our work necessarily isn't to anticipate what the other person is and change our way of being for the other person. Our work is to be the same person no matter the situation. So in a interaction that would be challenging for the green, right? Because the green is the one who comes in, right? Their work is to be patient. Their work is to practice patience, to feel that sensation in the body of the urgency of that need to get right to the point, and instead notice that sensation, label it to themselves. Okay, this is urgency in my body. I'm trying to get to the point right now. I want to try and relax. I want to try to soften my body in this moment. I want to try to access the present moment, see the person in front of me as somebody I want to be helpful to, I want to be supportive of, I want to talk to on a, person to person level and see how that changes the dynamic, see how that changes, their productivity, their efficiency, et cetera, et cetera.
Hmm. Yeah, and if I may add one other thing, so yeah, you definitely want to connect in the moment, but another way, at least that's worked for me,
Mhm.
is to build the trust, let's call it in the relationship in advance of the actual conversation.
That's
So,
good. Yeah.
a leader that's contributing continually to the relationship when the moment comes, so Rick Lavoie, I don't know if you're familiar with the name,
Mhm.
he's big in the world of special education and he uses poker chips as a metaphor. And he talks about when the chips are down, as if to say there's certain students in the classroom that are not popular, they're not socially with it, they don't have a
Mhm.
lot going on academically, and so
Yeah.
they don't have a lot of poker chips.
Mhm.
Whereas the king or the queen of the prom, let's call it, and the ones who are the star football quarterback or great at school or all the above, they've got many, many chips. So there's you could take a risk and you can perhaps mess up and it won't really count against you. Whereas if you don't feel like you've got a lot of equity, there's
Mhm.
very little to work with. So I
Yeah.
think of it because as a green, I will write the body of the email and then I'll add a good morning.
Right.
I'll add a
In the
salutation
moment.
because it doesn't come to me first, but I know it's got
Yeah.
to be in there because
Yeah.
that's just the way that I have
Mhm.
to think. So I use that also because again, like you said, we are who we are. And
Yeah.
oftentimes people think I need to change who I am. You really can't. I think it's if you can, it's extremely difficult. Let's put it that way. It's a lot
Mhm.
easier to understand your strengths, to live with
Yes.
them, but to be
Mhm.
mindful of how certain elements of how you interact can be taken by somebody else in a
Mhm.
negative way. And how do you, I guess, adjust for that?
Yeah.
So I want to stay in the world of communication. I do want to pivot a little bit, and I'm curious to know, as an Orthodox Jew, I'm not familiar necessarily with every element of different, let's call it different religions and whatnot. But you talk about communicating, talking to yourself like, and
Mhm.
meditating like a Buddhist.
Yes.
So since I've never really spent any time in that world, I'm
Mhm.
curious to know what is it about Buddhism in particular
Mhm.
that creates a framework
Yeah.
specifically around these areas.
So Buddhism is a great framework, I think, because there's the Four Noble Truths, which basically say that suffering exists. And then that's the first noble truth is that suffering exists. The second is that the reason we suffer is our, attachment and desire to things. And so the third is that there's a way out of suffering. And the fourth is the noble path, which is the practices that bring us out of suffering, right? So one of the practices in the Eightfold Path is right speech. And the elements of right speech in Buddhism are to tell the truth, don't gossip, use helpful language, and don't exaggerate. And so the idea is, how do you filter your language through those four elements of right speech? When you do that, when you start to filter your language through, you start having more kind, honest, and helpful conversations. You start speaking more of what's useful and helpful and necessary, and you start cutting out what's not necessary. You become more responsive in interactions because you start using silence in a different way. Silence, usually we use silence to like power over potentially, or to, push away. And in this instance, we use a lot of silence and these, this breath, this kind of pause to really take stock of the interaction itself and to be able to choose a different path, right? And the other piece within Buddhism is meditation. And meditation really is, I believe it's really like the formal practice of intentional communication, of communicating in an intentional way. Because what it teaches you how to do is it teaches you to train your brain, right? It teaches you to train your mind into noticing distraction, noticing what's helpful, noticing what's pulling you in a direction that isn't going to be beneficial. And instead of becoming that or sitting in that and getting stuck in that, you are acknowledging it and saying, oh, hey, I see you. Thanks so much for sharing. I'm going to come back to the present moment and, be where I am. And in a difficult interaction or in a conversation, we're constantly being pulled out by our thoughts, right?
Mhm.
We can get caught in what the other person is saying. We can get caught in our questions or our thoughts about what's happening after this or what's happening before this. And we can lose all sense of where we are, right? I've been in many conversations where I've walked out and had no idea what that conversation actually was because I wasn't even there mentally.
Mhm. Mhm.
So it really helps you learn how to be present and to be able to listen and to hold space and all of that
Mhm.
with a non-judgmental attention.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you a judgmental question.
Go
Not
for
really
it.
judgmental, but it has a
I love it.
certain judgmental tone to it, I guess. So
Sure.
let's say I'm a type A leader. I'm the kind of guy who's just pedal to the metal, work,
Mhm.
work, work. I don't know, forgive me. I don't have time for this fluff kind of
Yeah.
mindset. And so
Hmm.
you're coming in with mindfulness and breathing and holding space, and
Yeah.
and that feels, I don't want to say new age to people, but it feels definitely not old school
Right.
to a lot of folks, especially in, let's call it, a corporate setting or even a regular rough and tumble work environment. What do you say to people who are not naturally inclined to this way of thinking and this way of
Mhm.
acting, as to sell, not to sell your services, though I'm sure that's necessary for that too, but to sell the benefits? Like, how do you get people to change their way of thinking
Yeah.
that this actually is important, and spending some time working on yourself before you dive into the work at hand
Hmm.
will reframe and positively affect everything you do, short and long term?
Yeah. Well, I think the biggest piece is that one has to realize that the way that they're working now isn't working for them, right? They're starting to notice that, the interactions that they're having are creating a ripple effect that isn't very positive within their work environment, or they're noticing with, clients that um, they're a little more hot-headed than they usually are, or what have you. There has to be an awareness for the person first that the way that things are happening or working isn't really working for them. The other piece is that we are so used to moving through the working world in this very direct, straight path kind of way, right? Like, there's a problem, we need to fix it. And that is all I mean, it works in some capacities, right? But the way I frame it is, when we harden, because that's what we eventually do in these moments. We aren't able to listen. We aren't able to be creative. We aren't able to see different paths. We see one pointed focus and we go right into like what is right and what is wrong. And it's very difficult to grow in that place, right? And when we learn to soften or take a breath or take 30 seconds to simply center ourselves before we interact, what we're doing is we're giving ourselves the ability to adapt. We're giving ourselves the ability to become more flexible. It's like in martial arts, right? In martial arts, if you are tense and stiff, if someone comes and attacks you, you're just going to fall right down. But if you soften your body, if you drop your weight, if you're really in touch with the present moment where you are, someone comes to you, you can navigate, you can pivot, you can, work yourself around the issue and find a way to, solve the problem in a different manner. And it's very similar in that way because, Harvard Business Review did a study and it mentioned that CEOs who are able to adapt are 6.7% more likely to succeed. And I think that with the work that I teach, which is not for everybody, right? It really isn't. But it really is for those people who want to be able to adapt and pivot and become more resilient in those moments instead of fighting against what comes to you, to be able to really allow what comes to you so that you can think and see really truly what is the best direction, right?
Mm. I would have thought it was even higher than 6.7%. Although I don't know exactly how they're measuring
I
success,
don't,
but
yeah,
I think
but
resilience is
exactly.
actually, yeah, very important. Okay, so there's a lot more that I'd like to ask you, but we do have to talk about pivot and transition
Okay,
to our next segment. Before we do, though, I
sure.
ask all of my guests because um, I know you alluded to it a little bit maybe at the beginning, but oftentimes we show up and we're experts, we know everything, and not that we, I don't mean in an ego sense, but we're very
Yeah.
smart and we're accomplished.
Mhm.
And people think of us as, well, they probably were just born that way. They probably just had a great and easy, smooth path to this point in their careers. And I know for myself, there were a lot of mistakes along the way that helped me, still in my own evolving process, become who I am today. So, what would you say for yourself, Cynthia, was the mistake that you made somewhere along the way that really pointed you in the right direction, that has helped you become the person you are today?
Yeah. So I I really feel like it wasn't so I really feel that what got me here today is the passing of my first love. In terms of because it really shifted the way that I live in the world. Like there was a life before that and a life after that. And that put me on this path. But there have been many mistakes that I have made from then till now, in terms of allowing others' voices to really cloud my own knowing and judgment of situations. And especially within my business or within the work that I do, really ignoring that inner voice that is inside that is telling me to go a specific direction and instead listening to others and doing more of what they told me to do and it not being as successful, right?
Yeah,
So
right.
a lot
Mm,
for me has those are really the mistakes that I've made where I'm not listening to myself and I'm listening to other people more or
got it.
giving them more power in a lot of ways.
I think everyone can relate to that for
Yeah.
sure. Because you want to hear what other people have to say. Oftentimes
Yeah.
they have more experience, things of that
Mhm.
nature, and sometimes we frankly don't know. What's the
Yeah.
best way forward? All
Yeah.
right, so it's time for some rapid fire, where as we say, the
Okay.
answers are short and sweet. One communication principle that you feel the world needs most.
I feel the world needs most to learn how to talk to themselves in a way that is kind, honest, and helpful.
Morning or evening meditation.
Morning.
A book besides your own that has influenced your communication philosophy.
Oh gosh. The Art of Communication by Thich Nhat Hanh.
A common mistake people make when they're trying to communicate more kindly.
A common mistake that people make when they're trying to communicate more kindly. They think they have to be dishonest.
Okay. How you unwind after a busy day?
I knit
Oh,
and have
okay.
tea. Yeah.
Nice. Your favorite comfort food or snack?
I love yogurt with cacao powder, maple syrup, and apples, and a little bit of cinnamon.
If you could live anywhere in the world for a year, where would it be?
Oh, Spain.
Spain?
Hmm.
What's a hobby or activity that you love that people might not expect?
Lacrosse.
If you could listen to one song for an entire week, what would it be?
Oh gosh. Andy Grammer Magic.
And finally, a productivity tip that helps you to get more done.
I only schedule 3 calls a day.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you scheduled this one.
Yes.
So before we wrap up, Cynthia, I am going to ask you to let everybody know, first of all, how they can reach you, learn more about you, benefit from your work.
Sure. So you can reach me going to my website at cynthiakane.com. You can follow me on Instagram at cykane1. I'm also on LinkedIn. And yeah, you can grab my books. The newest one comes out next week. So The Pause Principle, How to Keep Your Cool in Tough Situations. And yeah, that's how you can find me.
Awesome. So before you go, kindly leave us with one final life lesson to wrap up our episode.
Okay. One life lesson is really, it's a quote that I absolutely love by Deepak Chopra. And he said, "Do you want to be a prisoner of your past or a pioneer of your future?"
That's pretty deep. And
Yeah.
since we're recording on a Friday, so it's going to give me an entire weekend to consider. It's been a
Mhm.
pleasure. Thank you very much for coming on to Lead to Succeed. Thank you for sharing your insights, your experience, your story.
Mhm.
And I do believe we'll hopefully be able to get this out on the day of release and hopefully be able to, therefore, as a result, help you share this even your book and your message even further. So thank you again,
Thank you.
Cynthia.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for listening to this episode and for investing in yourself so that you can lead to succeed. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review the show. Your feedback gives the show more social proof and encourages more folks to listen.